and see me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Okay. I'll take my POIs in the chat, preferably from closing. I just put in the chat and I will call you out when I want to take a POI. Okay, give me a minute. Let me set my timer. Right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Death is an inevitability, both sides agree. It is the notion that our time on this earth, however limited, is finite. Like any resource, OG believes that we have to maximize our time in the way that makes the best utility of it. On Gov, maximization looks very simply like just prolonging life in a resistance to death. This just means that we get the best forms of life. We maximize the time we have here by not squandering it away, by not risking our time, risking the time we have to experience new things, to make meaningful connections, to have lived experiences with the ones we care about. We think this is simply just what government wants fundamentally. I think one line of setup before I go into 2 lines of argumentation. Basically, what does it really mean to resist death? All right, it means that we know that death is an endpoint of every single life. That means we're not acting in denial of any death. We recognize that death still exists regardless of anything that we can do. However, it is when we die that what OG wants to do. So we will take precautions against potential risky deaths or meaningless deaths that doesn't have any consequence. That means we won't like randomly speed because we feel like we like the thrill of it. We won't go for bungee jumping if we know we're fundamentally afraid of heights and we know that that place is potentially dangerous. It doesn't mean like paranoia. That means we're not going to live our lives in fear of death every single day. All we know is we're not going to run into any cars. We're not going to jump in front of a train because death is the only thing that gives life meaning. We don't think this is something that will exist in our world. So that means we won't do stupid things that could add to death. We won't do stupid things that could cater to risk. It matters if we die. So we take necessary and reasonable precautions against it. That means that we will still regret the time in which we die and will make most of the time we have left. So therefore, 2 argumentations. First, how the resistance of death is the fundamental understanding of permanence after it. And secondly, the fundamental disruption of capital for any and all societal change within a society that thinks the resistance to death is futile and pointless. So if there are any clarifications, I'll take it now. If not, I'll move on. So, no. 1, where the resistance to death is the fundamental understanding of permanence after it. 3 layers of analysis. Number 1, once you have death, you have to recognize that there are fundamental things that you leave behind. It looks like the actions you take when you were alive. It looks like the relationships you had, both with your family, your friends, and the impacts you had on strangers. It looks like the legacy you leave behind, be it in a career, be it in other people's lives. You exist in the collective memories of those who you leave behind once you pass away. The understanding of this fundamental thing is what makes life meaningful, that things exist after death and that things matter once you die. The only way in which you are able to effectively impact this, or the way that you counter this into weighing, is when you prevent death or when you live in resistance to death. Because if you run into death all the time, it just seems that you don't really care about the kinds of things that exist post your death, the kinds of things of how you exist in the light of other people or in the memories of other people once you die. It means that if you don't think that your life needs to be maximized, or the time you have needs to be maximized, that means you necessarily throw away additional time you had to leave better legacies, to have better actions, to care for more people, to find meaningful relationships and have lived experiences that could potentially bring you additional satisfaction and additional happiness for the time in which you're alive. Instead, you throw away this when you think that you just submit to fate and then death just comes whenever it comes. We think you necessarily throw away and sacrifice these kinds of things. But secondly, UP doesn't get these kinds of meaningful relationships, lived experiences when they have this due to temporary nihilism. And the reason for this is because UP thinks it's up to fate and that nothing really matters in this world because we shouldn't live in resistance to death. That means they'll just do whatever they want with the time that they have left. And when death comes, it comes. There's nothing I could have done about it. This means it disregards everything else and feeds into the temporary nature of things. That means you don't care about what legacy you leave behind. You don't care about the bad relations you have because you don't need the extra time to fix all these kinds of things. Only on Gov, where you recognize that these things are important, which is the point in which you need this extra time in order to carefully, meticulously, always ensure that your legacy you leave behind is good, that you have the kind of relationships, that you don't miss your chance with individuals who you could have gotten to relationships to, or you could have established good connections to. At the point in which Op just thinks that not living in resistance to death means that they just feed into a lot of nihilism and a lot of societal degradation, is when you miss out on things that really brings you happiness. Because in order to Op, nothing really matters. Because if I die, it's a chance of fate. I could have done nothing about it, and therefore I shouldn't care. On Gov, we just fundamentally don't think this is true. So finally, what does OG uniquely get? We get the kinds of fulfilling experiences that guarantee a fulfilling life. We get lived experiences, we get meaningful relationships, and you get the necessary opportunities you get to live in order to make a good life. Op necessarily defies this when they live in resistance to it, when all they do is just feed into a narrative that life only matters because of death, and that life you just cut short your time left because you just do risky things. You feed into necessarily harmful. That's the burden they have to prove. The individuals will just do whatever they want, regardless of the risk, because we shouldn't live in resistance to death. We should just feed into whatever fate has planned for us. Before I move on, I'll take CEO.
So what's your position on extending life, particularly, especially for those individuals whose life is already hard as it is, but because of your narrative, they couldn't take any other outlet at the end of the day?
Okay, I think for individuals whose life are already hard, I think it's necessary to extend that kind of things in order to gain the kinds of opportunity instead of just giving up and submitting to your fate. And whatever comes my way, comes my way. It's necessary in order to extend the kind of life, extend the kinds of experiences. So even if you don't break out of poverty, even if you don't improve your life, at least you have meaningful experiences that brings you some degree of happiness when your life is already so hard. We think only when we extend that we get these kinds of unique forms of happiness. But secondly, why fundamental disruption for any capital or societal change occurs under opposition. Number one, resistance to death means valuing more for your life. That means necessarily when you live in resistance to death, whatever minutes you have left matters because you want to prolong death as much as possible. You recognize that death is an endpoint, and you want to further whatever life you have. And you want to run from death in order to have these kinds of experiences, have these forms of happiness, have these forms of memories, which only occurs when you live in resistance. So secondly, why a nihilistic society doesn't care about life is because they believe of inevitability, noting now that they have reluctance and apathy because oppression really doesn't matter, or anything doesn't matter, because bear with it, because life really doesn't matter. All you do is race towards death. You take all these kinds of risks. You go in the wild in order to do the things that you want to do, and you don't get the kinds of capital you want because people just fundamentally don't care. If I get oppressed, it's rather I just die. These kinds of narrative means you don't get the form of change that you need. That means no movement or no change will ever occur because the thought of one day that everybody dies, if I'm oppressed, if I'm in hardship, as closely opposition wants to say, if I have all these hardships, I might as well just kill myself and get it over with. We think this is a fundamentally problematic thing that comes from opposition. We are the only side that fundamentally actually accepts the meaningfulness of life in its entirety. Side OG.
All right, I thank the Prime Minister. Now invite the Leader of the Opposition, Syakir.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with opening government is that they assume that all because you live a longer life, therefore you'll be able to have some form of meaning within your life. This doesn't do with the comparative that maybe if you lived a shorter life and did more things that are risky towards you, or things that are more short-termist, it still could bring far more value than, inshallah, hopefully some individuals who I can forge meaningful connections with. And in the hopes that even if I'm depressed throughout the first 30 or 40 years of my life, maybe there'll be meaning at the end of the day. I'll have 2 arguments today. Firstly, why life is more meaningful in a world where people are more without this narrative, and secondly, how this helps individuals who are depressed. Before that, just a few points of framing. The first thing that we would say is that resistance to death looks like things like not taking big risks and not wanting to do things that could risk you to die, which means that there is a premium on survival and having a long life. This means that in government's world, a long life is an a priori good because hopefully that will bring more meaning to you. What we would say is that a meaningful life doesn't always have to be surviving and living a long life, because sometimes long-term goals in life isn't something that will bring you meaning because it takes a lot of time to reach there, you might not reach it. And secondly, that you require a relative level of sustenance and privilege for you to live a long life in this juncture. The second point of framing is what is a meaningful life? And I think that this is what opposition will support. We agree with opening government that in our world, we'll accept the futility of death. That as much as you want and as much as you do, death will always be the conclusion of it. And embracing this means that you will focus on what you want in life right now. So we will acknowledge that in our world, people will be more short-termist, people will have a shorter life, but we will say that this is a more meaningful life as opposed to being one cog in a long machinery that could give you suffering. Before I go into my two arguments, a few points of responses. The first thing that they said is this was a characterization that prolonging life means you're more likely to do different things and have more relationships and friends. I think that this is possible, but less likely to happen in the world of opening government. The reason why this is true is because once you put a premium on a long life, that means you're more often going to not do short-term decisions in hopes that you can have long-term goals that we materialize, right? Because that's what a long life is in general. It looks like, for example, if you want to smoke and that gives you a lot of joy and happiness and it gives you a nicotine high, you're unlikely to do that because it will affect my health in the long term. It looks like going to college even if you don't want to, because this is how I'm able to sustain myself for a long period of time. So that means that they can't co-op doing and taking many risks because that's not going to happen in their world. The second is that they say that life should be meaningful so that you're able to care about the memories and live on the memories of other people and can leave legacies. The first response I have is that this is a horrible way to live. The reason why this takes away meaning from you is because you're at the behest of what other people think, and you're less likely to do what you want, but listen to what your parents envision and project onto you as a child as to what they want my child to be, because that's what my family lineage wanted of me, right? Which means that a lot of times the choices that make life more meaningful for you are more restricted because you're dependent upon the standards of your children or your future children in that regard. The second thing that we'll say is that relations and forging relationships isn't mutually exclusive. This is because a lot of nihilistic individuals are still social creatures to a certain extent. All because life is futile doesn't mean that I can't make friends and enjoy like smoking up with them from time to time. The third thing that we would say is that a fulfilling relationship shouldn't be dependent upon the length of it, but the actions that you do within this particular relationship. And given that I said that people are more likely to be short-term, this looks like taking more risks with friends, doing more dangerous short-termist things with them, and we think that that's a benefit. The last response I have is in terms of oppression. I genuinely think that this is a red herring. The reason why is because people don't protest, all because they think that life is meaningful. A lot of nihilists and a lot of depressed individuals still help out other individuals because protesting and joining social capital for movements isn't about the length, but more of, as of right now, there are immoral things that are happening that don't fit into my code of what I think life should be or what life could be right now. And as a result, because I'm a moral person and I confide with my friends who are African-American or LGBT, I'll still help them. You don't have to want to live to be able to want to help other individuals out. First argument, why is life more meaningful in our world? The first thing that we would say is that more individuals will opt into short-termism. The reason why is because in government's metric, a meaningful life equals to fighting off death, which means that there's a premium of having a long life. And in this long life, you want the best for yourself in this particular long period of time. This means that people will opt into long-term decisions that make them unhappy. This looks like, because your meaning of life is pegged onto longevity, it looks like going through university when it makes you unhappy and taking student loans, because the longer I live or the more privileged I become in this society, the longer I'll be able to access things like private healthcare, perhaps. It looks like not following your passions or like passions that couldn't be as lucrative, because it will affect me in the aftermaths or after parts of my life, in the latter parts of my life. The reason why all these bad decisions are made is because they are founded in the belief that meaning will come later and I'm going to live life for a long time. So I should suffer now and benefit later. The problem with this form of metric is that A, it doesn't always materialize. A lot of people who go through medical school may not even get placements, such as in Malaysia. The second is that during this period of time, there is a large opportunity cost. And this is the comparative in the second level. We think that once you accept that death is inevitable, what we do and what we want to do will dissipate, and like whatever we do in the long term will dissipate when I die. And that's sad. What people are more likely to do is opt in towards short-termism, right? And we think that short-termism is a better model that guarantees happiness because firstly, you require less capital to enter short-term decisions. Secondly, people will be less risk adverse, so they're more likely to take these daredevil stunts that they think will bring them happiness. And thirdly, we think people can opt in towards bad decisions that make them happy, like things like smoking or consuming alcohol. The reason why this makes life more meaningful is because the value of life is pegged upon how you feel and how happy you are. So even if I live a short life, maybe I didn't go to university, but in this short duration of life, I'm more likely to have more experiences and more things that has made me happy. The second thing we would say is that this is more accessible because living a long life is actually hard. It requires a lot of money and it requires a lot of capital. We think a world of living in short-termism, like not going for your job for a week or making all these short-term decisions is better and more accessible. The second argument is how this helps the depressed. The point here is that some people don't enjoy life and sometimes things just won't get better, or some people just don't want to wait for things to get better. Maybe it's structural problems that you face. Maybe it's because you're poor. Maybe it's because even if you're rich, you just feel that life has no meaning. I think in our world, there are two benefits. The first is that individuals won't have to feel bad for feeling this way. And I think this is how depression compounds in many areas where they feel as if, and they are told that life is supposed to be meaningful, but they just don't feel it. And the second where we'll bite the bullet is that if life is an uphill battle and you don't want to go through it anymore, a world in which you don't have a prima life means that you can end suffering, and that's a net good towards these individuals. I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, I thank the Leader of Opposition. Now invite the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. Hello, Shireen, Shiha, I will take you as in the chat and I will likely take one. Yeah, okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the premise of the opposition case thus far is simply contingent on the idea that happiness is derived out of the feeling you get at a certain point in time. Luke's speech was literally premised on the idea that if you want to opt into smoking, even though it's something that's bad for you and might result in death in the future, because it makes you happy at that point in time, it is something you should do. I think there's two broad responses I have on that front. Number one, the idea of gaining experiences and fulfillment from those experiences in that moment still exists symmetrically on our side of the house. The only contention, therefore, is the idea of short-termism, which I'll talk about later on. But secondly, I would argue that the magnitude of fulfillment you get from those experiences is severely diminished on your side of the house because of the understanding that what you're doing is futile. The premise that Wesley gave you in his speech was not the fact that short-term happiness was good. It was the fact that long-term happiness and the fulfillment you derive out of actualizing yourself and knowing that you spent your time on earth in the most effective way possible to maximize what sort of limited capacity you have as a human being is what is happy. I agree with Luke when he tells everyone that the experiences you have on earth is what makes you happy. I disagree with saying that short-termism is the experiences necessarily that give you those things. The contention he gave in his speech was that the premise of OG is prolonging life, and a lot of times prolonging life is futile because things don't just get better. I'll talk about that later in my speech. The first broad rebuttal I have is the idea that you now on our side of the house have to go to college even though you don't want to, because that's what will help you survive longer. I don't necessarily think that's always the case in our side of the house, because Wesley's speech wasn't premised upon prolonging life on net. It was simply about using what life you had and the lifespan you had already on earth to do things that you necessarily wanted. This does look like avoiding things that are necessarily risky, like maybe not becoming a smoke addict or an alcoholic addict, or going to the extreme sports for the sake of adrenaline rush, which means you are taking active stances to want to prolong your life. But in instances where you don't want to go to college because you think that's not going to be survival, or that's not going, in instances where you don't want to go to college, I think that the comparative of not surviving is an extreme one, because you have other avenues by which you can still gain happiness but still prolong your life in the first place. I don't think that conversation was charitable. The next thing I want to talk about then is why a meaningful life is more defined on our side of the house, as opposed to the idea of short-term happiness coming out of the OO speech. A meaningful life, as defined by Wesley's speech, is contingent upon two things. One, your experiences, but to the extent of which you are willing to go to actualize those experiences and get back that sort of meaning towards you. I think your experiences matter to you for two reasons. They confer emotional fulfillment onto you, but they also create connections onto others and make your life less isolated in the world, but also mean that you derive happiness out of like the image you have in the eyes of other people. Luke contended this by saying it's bad for you to do so, but I would argue to you that the comparative and opposition is literally living for yourself and only prioritizing what you want in the short term, which I think is fundamentally less happy for you for a few reasons, and I'll talk about later on. The second thing that we're going to talk about is why the extent of which you're willing to actualize yourself in the long term is actually better than what short-termism that OO wants to talk about. Three reasons. One, fulfilling your own potential as a human being is one that is good, because even because you know and you understand what you're capable of doing on this earth, and you understand that you have the capacity to do things. So I think the attempt at trying to prolong your life, the attempt at trying to actualize your potential and fulfilling your life with things that make you happy over the long term is when it's better. But two, the autonomy you have over your life in being able to choose what you want instead of surrendering yourself to death and just willy-nilly choosing things that make you happy in the short term gives you that power and makes you feel like you have control over your life, and that's what confers to the fulfillment and actualization you want. Why is death not good? Two reasons. One, you're dead, so you literally cannot experience things on earth. But also, secondly, you lose out on the opportunity of trying other things. I agree with Luke when he says that death can be futile. And at some points, a lot of people who are suicidal have no way out and they feel like things are not going to get better. But the reason why death is not the solution in this instance is because they literally permanently stop any sort of attempt at getting better or even trying in the future, which means death in this instance is not the solution to happiness or the derivation of happiness in that instance, but a pop out of what could possibly increase in happiness in the future. The reason that's an important analysis is because it tackles the idea about death being the only way out and why we should therefore embrace death. I don't think embracing death is the way to go in these instances, because the only thing that happened in the debate in that conclusion is that nothing can change.
Yeah, so if you place a premium on having relationships with other people, does this apply to every single individual? Because some individuals are uncomfortable, they don't like the standards that other people place upon them, and sometimes they derive joy from doing things on their own volition and by themselves.
Correct. Yeah. So if you want to have a relationship with other people to make you happy, or if you want to live on your own to make you happy on both sides of the house, I think that's fine. The comparative is you're only allowed to prioritize yourself on your side of the house because of the very same short-term analysis that you gave in your speech. Reason being, you can't prioritize connections in the long term, because if you do so, you risk you take on the risk of having a really emotional breakup, your friends abandoning you, get into arguments, and so the short-termist behavior that you want is backfiring against you. At the very least, what we tell you on government bench then, that the derivation of happiness you get from these relationships is the one that's better, because you understand that life is finite and the inevitable looming of death over you necessarily means that you prioritize these connections even more. More on that later on. Let's talk about short-termism being a good thing in response to opening opposition. The first thing to respond here is that once you understand the finite nature of life as though an opening government, the knowledge of death looming over you gives you the motivation to maximize life. That's why short-term happiness doesn't necessarily give you that sort of happiness, because the choices you make are incredibly narrow in their purview, and they don't necessarily give you that fulfillment because, yeah, I'll just take a smoke for the fun of it, which means that the short-term happiness goes away instantly after you finish that cigarette. That's the clear analysis we're going to give you in our argument later on, because at the very least, if on our side of the house, the long-termism being futile gives you at least the fulfillment of trying in the first place. On your side of the house, the little short moments of happiness do not confer fulfillment because they go away after like a short period of time, and you never feel fulfilled about it because all that happens is you chase highs. Next thing I want to talk about then is why the argument of suicide doesn't necessarily hold, directly going into the second argument of opening government. I would argue that I agree to a large extent there's a lot of things wrong in the world, and a lot of people often resort to suicidal thoughts as like an escape. I would argue in response though that suicide is never the answer, because overcoming death and taking the decision to stand against death is in and of itself something that's empowering and fulfilling towards you. Notice here that these individuals do not have to necessarily fix the problems around them or the material conditions they exist in to like overcome like the poverty cycle or whatever, but standing against it is in and of itself fulfilling for a few reasons. One, you exercise your autonomy to at the very least try and make a capacity shift on your life, that you're taking a stand against these things and saying, I'm not in a good place right now, but I will at least try to move myself forward. That attempt in and of itself makes you feel like you have some sort of power in your life instead of just copping out of it by dying. The second reason why that's an important thing for you to do is that when you do overcome these things and you get to a place in life when you feel as though you're happier, when you look back on your suicidal intentions, you'll be like, that's not necessarily what I wanted to do. I'm content in my life now. I'm happy that I didn't do those things. That is why resisting death is important, is because when you look back and you see all the hardships you've gone through, knowing that you persevered is something that gives you the fulfillment you want. The last thing here is the idea about fighting unjust death and how it generates the capital you need to like fight against it. Luke talked about how on their side of the house, the reason why people still protest like social injustices is because the moral compass. I would argue to you the reason the moral compass exists is literally because people resist death. That is the premise upon which the Black Lives Matter movement fights against police brutality, because it resists in the unjust death of individuals on the ground. If the old case was true and that death is futile, and oftentimes we just embrace death when it comes upon us, they wouldn't fight against these things because they see it as part of the system of death or the police institution as a whole, and therefore it's something that has to happen. The only side that gives you a marker of life and the only side that gives you a definition as to how you should live your life maximally is OG.
All right, I think the Deputy Prime Minister now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yeah, you're all good.
I think the biggest problem with OG is that they assume that when people look back into the hardships that they have made, and if the outcome is just nothing, they can still feel as if they've led a meaningful life. When this is inaccurate, for a majority of people that currently exist in our world, where things such as 40% of the world is facing poverty and climate change and numerous amounts of problems that are plaguing even the most developed economies, simply knowing that you've tried is not enough to fulfill meaning. This is the fundamental problem with OG. They claim that a long-term plan is the best one because that is where, when you reap the reward, can give you the greatest amount of happiness. In theory, we agree. Unfortunately, they do no job of telling you why this blueprint is applicable to the current generation of individuals living on Earth. Because for individuals who skew college and attempt to work at a business, they fail when something like the pandemic happens. For individuals who get into college, get into a good job, still can fail because they may be dealt with racial discrimination. For individuals that do their best, are straight and white, can still die because of an accident due to a drunk driver on the road. All of this goes to show you is evidence that a long-term plan that does not result in the best outcome is something that is extremely deplorable. And in absence of government showing us why, in majority of the times, people can fulfill their long-term plans, they lose this debate. What else did we tell you? I think Luke already made the concession early in opposition that we are okay with shorter bursts of happiness and we are okay with individuals living relatively short-term lives. Why? Because even if the fulfillment of a goal is relatively short-term and it can fade, the fact of the matter is you can try to do something else. You can continuously have different goals, sometimes even simultaneously. In spaces of these goals, you might die or you might face extreme problems that mean that you cannot try anymore. Okay, because in the meantime, up to that point, you've already experienced some level of happiness through attaining different types of goals that was more accessible to you as a unique individual. This comparative is much better than government's comparative of waiting at the end of the line and hoping that your goal is reached. Then what do they tell you? They tell you the solace is your connections, the people that you meet along the way, and the relationships that you invest in long term will mean that regardless of what you're going through, you can access happiness because it's about your legacy. First of all, the benefit of legacy is only happening after you die. I'm unsure as to what government knows, but I'm pretty sure you don't know what happens after you die. So the benefit of getting a legacy or a flamboyant funeral where everyone delivers a eulogy about how amazing you are as a person is something that you will never feel because you are dead. But secondly, and more importantly, the connections that they are talking about are similarly premised on the idea that if you invest enough time, you can develop emotional connections. Not true. People have been married for 20 years and can divorce. People have been in abusive families and they continuously stay that way. And even in death, they don't resolve their problems. Just because you're willing to invest time doesn't mean a strong emotional connection can develop. And even when that happens, the only time you're able to reap that benefit is when you die. Ultimately, this comparison is something that Gov cannot push in comparison to OO. For all the faults of opening opposition, having to say that we need to deal with less happiness because the goals that short-term goals can provide you is less, is fine because we already told you why at least A, it's attainable, and B, accessible to more numbers of unique individuals. Then they tell you that no, this also allows you to access change because when individuals under this narrative see people die from police brutality, the feeling of wanting to resist death will lead you to fight for individuals. If that is true, status quo is where now we all resist death. Are we protesting because people are dying on the street? No, that's because altruistic individuals feel pain when they see another person suffering. I think the issue of change, oppression, and evolution of the human race is multifaceted and cannot be reliant on one facet of you thinking that you need to live a long life. So I think the outcome that government attempts to prove may be good about why we fight for change, but I don't know why it's linked to this narrative. Moving on into positive material. But before that, do I have a point from closing? Okay, now, moving on. Let's also talk about this problem of grief. Because I think the fact that they tell you about why these interpersonal connections will give you a lot of happiness is one that is a good thing. Not true. In current status quo, I think the fact that you are emotionally connected to another individual is what leads to a lot of people feeling unhappiness. What does this mean? The fact that you are attempting to resist something futile means that a lot of times in status quo, people are put in palliative care, they are put on ventilators, they are put on breathing tubes. All individuals are taking medications to extend their life as much as possible because of the fact that they want to maintain this narrative of useless connections. The point is, a lot of times, these are individuals that are suffering. Over 60% of the calls of euthanasia are coming from terminal patients all across the world because they don't find meaning in prolonging a life that is futile anyway. Unfortunately, these are individuals that undergo the suffering in status quo because the narrative is you need to live long for the people that are around you. To what extent are we abusing this narrative where individuals are in pain and yet they must continue to strive and suffer because it may impact other individuals in the future? Is our narrative one that is more selfish? Yes. But why is that bad? I'm not sure. Because in a world of government, you are asking individuals who have faced systemic oppression, who have felt failures upon failures and see no hope in the change of light. I don't think DLO can simply say and condense all of these problems into saying that, no, you need to look back. And then when you see that you've at least tried, you can feel happy. I don't think that is something that you can apply to a majority of individuals that are undergoing these problems in status quo. What did opening opposition tell you? We told you why this narrative is the one that complements the current generation and the struggles that they are undergoing. We told you why this is likely to have the disillusioned introverts and individuals who are depressed in status quo. We told you why it is very likely that individuals can access this better because of the fact that these are goals that are more attainable and function in the short term. And we told you why, even if you live relatively shorter lives, it is lives that are richer. For those reasons, very proud to be on opposition.
All right, I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now I invite the Member of Government. You're here.
Am I visible and audible?
Yep, all's good.
Okay, so POIs in chat, I'll probably take 1 by 5. If I don't, Jen, just verbally interrupt me. Also, our internet connection here is pretty unstable. So if at any point I do disconnect, please let me know. I'll start my speech in a bit. Let me just get my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When my mother got cancer, she could have easily said, "This is a horrible life and I'm giving up now." But instead, she chose to look for happiness in things that were important, things like her family, things like her children. This was what was motivating to her at the end of the day, to find meaning when you're resistant to death, because she found meanings in things that probably she wasn't paying attention to before. Firstly, a few levels of responses. The primary clash in the opening exchange is that some people live shitty lives, so death is probably just around the corner, so why care? The metric to determine happiness is one that is personalized and malleable. This means that it's no longer big conglomerates dictating what happiness means to you. Individuals have started to redefine what happiness means. This looks like plus size models challenging beauty standards despite people saying being obese is unhealthy and can probably result in you dying. This looks like poor people finding solace in religion even when people tell them that being poor is a suffering of its own. This means that people constantly change what happiness means to them because happiness as a concept is malleable. More importantly, framing, right? So decision making is not binary. I don't know why the claim coming from OO is as if you either have to make an extreme decision or you have to die, right? Actions can exist on a spectrum. This can look like taking life insurance. This can look like having a healthy diet, double masking, taking vaccines. It doesn't have to be on an extreme. Why is this true? This is status quo. People actively take steps to prolong life. People actively take steps to ensure security and safety. On to my primary extension. I have 3 extensions today. Firstly, what are the unique features of being death resistant that proves a meaningful life? We have 3 analyses to this. So OG kind of talked about this when they spoke about time, but basically what it means is that when you live a longer period of time, mathematically you have more attempts at seeking happiness and meaning in your life. You have more time to look for reasons to be happy. Conversely, when you are not resistant to death, you are reaped away from this benefit of time. You don't have that privilege of time to look for happiness or look forward to a future where you can have some other semblance of happiness. Second prong on maturity and experience. So we have to understand that things change over time. Things that were a problem in the past in our personal lives probably won't be problems in the future. If you're depressed now and that could be a problem to you now or in the past, you probably have now found some other avenues to express that. You probably are going to therapy. You're probably seeing a mental health professional, and that is no longer a problem to you now. If you're poor, you probably thought that was a problem, but now you find solace and comfort in things like religion and family. This just goes to show that as time goes by and you have that privilege of time, you mature and you gain the experience and you can find happiness in different phases. And this leads me nicely to my third prong. Third prong is different phases of life. When you are in different phases of life, it guarantees different and versatile forms of happiness. When you're a kid, probably playtime with your friends was happiness. Probably eating was happiness to you. When you're a teenager, it probably could look like dating, or people probably could look like people trying out new things, because that's the point of their life where they're exploring who they actually are. When you're old, it could probably be spending 60 years of your life with the love of your life, and that is a happiness to you. And these things can overlap. So when you're old, you can still find happiness in the things that gave you happiness when you were a youth and when you were a kid. The comparative is here that in your world, they constantly make reckless decisions and reduce their time because they don't care about death. At the end of the day, this reaps them from all this possible 3-pronged benefit that we just gave you. Therefore, it reduces your chances of actually finding meaning in your life. Second extension, why the pursuit of happiness is better when you're death resistant. Being death resistant doesn't just mean like avoiding death and taking necessary steps. It's also being aware of a moment of finality. When you're aware of a moment of finality, you explore and appreciate the things around you much better. You're more likely to find meaning in different parts of your life because you realize that your time on this earth is limited. You probably find meaning in holding your partner's hands. You probably find meaning in looking your partner in the eye. You probably could find meaning in in seeing your parents happy and making the people and your friends around you happy. The comparative to this extension is that when you take a risk, then what happens? You constantly take risks. Then what happens? You're stuck in a perpetual cycle of taking risks, and at the end of the day, that doesn't give you any meaning because you thought, and the premise of your assumed happiness was that if I take risks, I'm going to find more meaning. When that at the end of the day proves to be false, you will never be able to access this happiness or this meaning that you wanted to in the first place. Third extension, why not being death resistant is a privilege, and this directly contends with what Ram and Luke wanted to claim. You have to understand that not caring about death is a privilege. Not everyone has the capacity and privilege to say, I don't care about whatever happens in this life because I have the privilege to do so. Firstly, you probably have the capacity and resources to not care. You probably come from a rich family. You probably live off like your trust fund or whatever. So you don't have any worries in your life. That's why you can just say, fuck it and YOLO. Number 2, your rights are probably protected by the government at the end of the day if you're a majoritarian group. If I'm a white person, I don't have to worry about anything because at the end of the day, my rights are already probably protected by the government. Minorities don't have that capacity. When you tell them you don't have to be death resistant, you expect them to be spectators in the horrors of oppression, exploitation of opportunity, and the suppression of rights. The fact of the matter is minorities have to work 10 times harder than majoritarian groups to access that same level of privilege. How is this being resistant to death, you might ask? Things like working so you don't starve. Things like working so your family can live a comfortable life, so you can put your children through college and give them an education which you probably didn't have the privilege to do anyway. Secondly, it could look like things like protesting against police brutality because you hate to see members of the community die at the hands of the state. And thirdly, it could look like things like collectivization, right? Demanding rights from a government which redefines what it actually means to be happy. The comparative is here, at least in our world, even if these attempts fail, at least what we have now are safe spaces and safe structures for these members of minority who probably won't have that same access to the privilege that you have if they weren't resistant to death. The fact of the matter is, when they are resistant to death, this gives them a better ability to collectivize for things. This gives them safe safe spaces which they then can utilize to find meaning, right? The conclusion of this argument is even if some people can access that privilege about not caring about death, some people can't. People have to work. People have to put their children through education. People have to survive for their families and for their communities at the end of the day because they have to give back. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world today which probably has a lot of risks, right? And yes, we understand the premise coming from, oh, that taking those risks may bring you more meaning because death is inevitable, so why care about it anyway? But we rather live in a world from side-closing government where people are aware of these privileges and know that when you live a life that is resistant to death, that is when you're more likely to find meaning in things that you probably didn't expect. That is when you're probably able to maximize your happiness in ways that you couldn't expect. That is when you're probably going to be able to maximize not only your happiness, but the happiness of your family, friends, and your communities. For all those reasons, I've been prouder to propose.
All right, I thank the member of government. Now I invite the member of opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, you're all good. Yeah.
Okay. I like few eyes in the chat box. Gov's biggest claim is that if I hit myself, I should just live with it. When I feel failure and I feel numb, then I should just walk it off. But I did that, and I walked it off. And sometimes the road just doesn't end. We say if taking the plunge is what you actually want, then we should just stop walking. Two pieces of extension. Firstly is how, on a macro scale, we need people to die for the cause in order to guarantee moral frameworks for society. And principally, being resistant to death is diametrically opposed to moral frameworks. And secondly, I'll do some deadlock breaking and finish opening opposition's argument about mental health. Before that, let's frame out closing government. Their argument is basically saying, well, just live with it because maybe there are other avenues for you to be happy. Mathematically, if you live longer, you probably have more avenues. This is interesting, considering their second argument is about how we are privileged. This first extension is actually privileged. It is privileged to the fact that people sometimes do not have the capacity to get those other avenues. It is privileged to the fact that maybe I cannot access things like hobbies, or I cannot access things like happiness in connections because my friends hate me and that makes me want to kill myself. This proves that it's incredibly circumstantial that you can get access to the imaginary benefit of closing government. Therefore, their argument is like circumstantial at best, and is also inconsistent with their second assertion. Frame out opening government, and this also deals with closing government as next. Opening government's best argument is that connections are an inherent good and opposition doesn't have any connections. Firstly, I think there are natural incentives for individuals on the ground to want to have connections because happiness is still a construct in society that people opt into and opt out of. We're just saying that opting out of it is something that is justifiable, but let's take them at their best. They assume that connections is an a priori good. But why are friends and the connection and the gratitude that other friend has is something that is more important to your own gratitude? And this is the moral comparison that they haven't actually made. I don't necessarily think that if I live longer, I should give back to society or I should give my mom some free healthcare, because giving my mom free healthcare means that I have to consistently work on a day in, day out basis and kill myself in my job. That is not comparatively better because on proximity, I owe it more to myself, especially because I did not even consent to the decision to begin with. Their attempt to make better will go against the cost, will impede on your ability to fulfill your life and fulfill your wants in life. Therefore, their argument is contingent. But let's break this deadlock on opening opposition. Opening opposition does a decent job in explaining why relationships are not inherent good, but we'll go a step further. Opening government says, if I'm depressed, get better connections. But what if my connections are the people that want to make me want to kill myself? What if my toxic girlfriend is the one that makes me want to die and wants to gaslight me on a day in, day out basis? And what if my family and friends is the one that makes me want to hate myself at the end of the day? I'm unsure as to why getting connections from those perpetrators and enemies of your society is an inherent good. What does this prove? This proves that even if I get better connections, I live a longer life. I deal with my perpetrator and I stay in these toxic relationships. The metric of this debate in opening government session is that utilitarian is an inherent good. Happiness is maximized in the scale of your life is good. We say that on a utilitarian standpoint, if you stop your life, you'll get more happiness because you reduce the amount of suffering that you go through. If Deputy Prime Minister says, if you die, you cannot live these experiences, we say these experiences are the one that makes you want to die and makes you want to hit yourself to begin with. I think on a utilitarian standpoint, we urge you to do these things, the point in which when you feel it is not worth living anymore. Extension of how opening government and closing both government benches entrenches stigma. Risk aversion is the we say that risk is the ingredient to get buy-in for macroeconomic macro model frameworks. The fear of death means you are going to avoid entering into decisions that will make you die or make you it will make you reduce your quality of life. This means, but unfortunately, there are certain causes that you need to die to get certain amount of benefits in the future. This looks like calling out against your authoritarian regime, even though you know that you might get killed because of speaking out. We say that this decision of being risk averse, taking this risk, is one that is beneficial because this gives you some access to other individuals on the ground and guarantees human rights in the future. What does opening government? What does government bench have to defend? They have to defend people not scared to voice out against an authoritarian regime. They have to defend the world where people are scared to enlist in the army because they just fear death and they don't want to be soldiers to begin with. They have to live in a world where people don't want to volunteer for experimental drug trials by virtue of being experimental. In the terms of conditions, you say that you can either get a cough or you might die in the future. We say that human beings should still take that risk because it gives utilitarian benefits to everyone at the end of the day. You require medical drug trials in order to get vaccines that closing government wants to tell you, the point in which when you're resistant to that, you're unlikely to even opt into these things. Therefore, harms materialize in government. Firstly, autocracies exist in perpetuity. Even if there are a lot of different variables to take down these authoritarian regimes, the consistent thing is that you need people to sacrifice their life. To a certain extent, you will have to die and certain people will die. But that is the rallying cry for everyone else to achieve critical mass and collectivization. But secondly, before I move on, I'll take prayer from OG. Please, quickly.
The premise of people fighting back against authoritarian regimes is authoritarian regimes cracking down on people and killing them unjustly, which is resistance to death. How is your case consistent?
Yeah, like you're scared, like you see your brother die. I don't want to die, therefore, and you see your brother voiced out against the regime, and he died. So I don't want to voice out against my regime because I don't want to die. And this is why you want to. That's what you're arguing, right? Okay. So the reason why this is important is because you need these moral frameworks to access benefits of long-term. If opening government says the metric of the state is long-term benefits, you create certain instances where we get vaccines in our side of the house because people are more willing to go into drug trials to guarantee those benefits for people in the future. But secondly, we also benefit people who did not consent to death to begin with. I think that's a primary goal in our side of the house. How we clean up opening opposition is we explain that this narrative, this stigma actually limits people from voicing out their pain. If every point they go out in society, people will say, just live your life, get better, don't be sad. That's when they fear being invalidated. That's when people die and people become silent. We say that life in fear of death is a life lived in silence. That is why we take this debate. Thanks.
All right, I thank the member of opposition. Now invite the government whip. Here.
can I confirm if I'm visible and audible?
Yeah, everything's good.
Okay. The day you die as an 18-year-old recklessly riding your motorcycle, you would probably internalize and rationalize that you don't remember what it's like laughing with your friends and having coffee after school because you're so internalized or fixated of taking risks, of not caring about death. You'll probably internalize that you regret not realizing the color of your partner's eyes because you're so fixated in finding a version of happiness in the short term, but not realizing that everything was around you all along. We think opposition team misses the nuance that there are many structures that exist to call out previously dictated versions of happiness. Happiness is becoming much more personalized. And for every adversity out there, there's an escapism that individuals can access, and a moment of finality is what we need in order to make life more meaningful. How am I going to structure my speech? I'm going to respond to all the houses in this debate. I'll tell you why we're different from opening government and why essentially our extensions win the debate. First, let's deal with CO. The first thing I want to point out is their case was mostly responsive and I don't see a flagging out extension. But secondly, I would just take their responses as a form of the extension and still tell you why they're out. First contribution from opening opposition. You don't owe an obligation to anyone else. You should care about yourself. First response is, I will argue why living your life on the long term or having the basis of being death resistant is good in terms of your premise of being selfish. And I'll tell you why, in terms of self-interest, it is better for the long term later on when I compare it with opening opposition. But secondly, directly responding with this meat of this argument, we will argue you do owe an obligation to people around you, especially your loved ones. Given the fact that you're a direct extension of a family that sacrificed, that brought you into this world, that put food on the table, you are directly responsible or a benefactor and reaping the benefits of these individuals giving up for you, therefore you're obligated to give back. Thirdly, it's more important to note that on an individual level, when you don't care about death, when you're reckless, that is still not within the spirit of motion of a meaningful life, because this also needs to be on a macro perspective. That means if you as an individual want to be reckless and end up dying, the connections that you make with your loved ones, your family that worry about you and wait for your return, all of these individuals are not having a meaningful life because of your individual right to be reckless. So in a collective, when everyone's more death resistant, more safe, more meticulously finding and exploring the versions of happiness, I would argue that's a meaningful life for a collective. We take that claim. Secondly, they said, what if your friends cannot help you because they cause a depression? Hello, firstly, that's in a minority. Secondly, you can change your friends. Thirdly, a lot of times family are informal support structure that provide you an opportunity in which they can listen to your suffering, listen to your adversities and give you some level of advice to go on. And also you can experience counseling to substantiate whatever your friends told you on top of that. But fourthly, deal with our analysis that happiness is malleable and personalized, which means you can have personalized versions of milestones as to what you want to achieve because that is recent, that is final, and what to make use of your life right now is something that they never dealt with. They also never dealt with the rationality argument that we provided, which is to say that at the point in which you mature and rationalize and broaden your horizon as you get more experiences, that is when previously construed problems may be normalized under your world. That means you're in a position to understand that whatever financial problem you're facing around can be probably alleviated through an investment scheme, for instance, can be probably alleviated to meeting a counselor or an expert, or the fact that when we're children, sleeping is always seen as a punishment, but now it's a reward, just goes to show that the scale in which or what we expect is a problem oftentimes change over time, and rationality and experiences time oftentimes counter-checks with the ability for you to do that. And they never acknowledge with our phases of life extension. That is to suggest that in every stage of life, i.e. being a child, being an adult, or being in an old age, there are always specific avenues of happiness that you can access. For example, the playground example that Ahsan gave you, or living a life with your partner that you live 50 years with and having a cup of tea. There are phases of life in which you can access, and always that entry point is given to you. I would argue that they were dismissive of that. CO is out. Let's deal with opening opposition. Opening opposition big claim is the fact that people make bad decisions right now and suffer now because they want to benefit off later. They think that's really bad because some people are dying and some people live really horrible lives. The first response I want to make is, some long-term decisions, you can accrue benefits in the short term, i.e. living a healthy life, you are avoiding the fact that you can get diseases, and diseases oftentimes kill you in the most literal sense or in the most times through physical sensations. The fact that you can avoid that is a net benefit because you pursued that long-term vision of wanting to be healthy. The fact that you might think medical school is suffering, it doesn't acknowledge the fact that you get benefits of the networking you make in medical school or the knowledge you can apply when you suddenly hurt or do some first aid emergency whatsoever. The point is there are benefits that can accrue in the short term as a result of making this long-term decision they did not want to acknowledge. But secondly, they did not want to acknowledge how exactly it is rational or privileged at a point in which you make the decision to pursue a reckless life in the short term. And I think this is significant because it's a privileged concept for you to say, I don't care about life, I want to cut school, but you're a white privileged male who's protected by your family, you can do so. What about ethnic minorities that have to work twice as hard? They are not in a position to be able to just say, YOLO and let me not care about life, because oftentimes these are vulnerable individuals that are imposed in circumstances where they have to be death resistant. So even in the best case, your meaningful life is one is saturated to only privileged individuals, and a vast majority of minorities are locked out of that fight. Before 6, I'll take a POI.
Why is the long-term plan going to be applicable to a malleable life that changes constantly versus short-term goals that can apply at different stages in your life?
The difference is, the delta here is, when you have short-term goals or risks, you don't know when it ends because there is no end goal. When there's a finality, which means you say death is inevitable and it's an outcome that will happen, I can most make use of my life by exploring the things around me because I know I'm going to die. When you don't know when you're going to die, you don't know the expiration date. Therefore, you don't get the utility and the level of happiness by doing all this risk because it's ambiguous to you. That is a response, and you also need to deal why exactly ostracize minorities who are not in a position to make that decision. What did opening government provide to you? Opening government essentially gave a great case, but essentially along one predicated premise, which is time. We mechanize this better by explaining rationality and maturity. We explain this better by explaining this malleable and personalized. We explain this better when telling phases of life that contribute towards why you're exactly happy. We also give additional things to explaining why exactly you learn to appreciate and explore your life at a point in which there is a finality and that's something that's different. And we told you why you ostracize minorities at a point in which you recklessly make decision to not care about life because it's a privileged concept. The bottom line is, our side is the only side that tells you for every problem that exists there are structures to call that out. There are problems to alleviate the problem, partying when you feel that you're suffering, or going to a counselor when you feel you're suffering. Life may be hell, but for some people, if they're able to amalgamate, unify with those structures, and come to terms that they can appreciate the true beauty and bountiful nature of life, I would argue that's a damn good life. Proud to propose.
Yeah.
All right, I thank the government whip, and now I invite the final speaker, the opposition whip. Here.
I am not visible. Okay. Am I visible now? Yes. Can I be heard?
Yeah. That.
Oh. Here is in the chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think closing opposition takes the debate because of a few things. Number one, I think we are the only side that regards on the, like, principally, why is it that resisting death, like fearing death is something that's very important, like not fearing death is something that's very important for a lot of individuals. We are the only side that provided to you some tangible impacts towards real life examples when it comes to regimes, for instance, or how you are having the ability for you to have experimental vaccines, for instance, or drug trials. We are the only side that proves to you the tangible impact. The other side in this debate only wants to talk about relationship. personalized happiness, but they never talk to you about when it comes to suffering and how do you alleviate suffering for these individuals. We are the only side that talks about tangibility when it comes to individuals from different perspectives of life. It's not just about the people who are privileged by the world and government when it comes to talking about how you are able to do whatever the fuck you want because you are privileged, right? Let's talk about why we win on our arguments firstly. In my member's speech, they mentioned, like when it comes to why people won't risk their lives for any causes, it's because they fear that they're trying to resist that. This looks like probably not participating in drug trials because they don't know the effects of death. But that means individuals who are in stage 4 cancer, for instance, probably wouldn't want to take away like experimental drug because they just don't know the effects of it. And if they die, they are scared of it. That means they are rather sit there having chemotherapies for non-stop because they believe that this is the only way for them to be able to stay alive. This is a harm when it comes to medical expertise being developed. Second, when it comes to soldiers enlisting in the army, I think a lot of individuals are probably not going to be enlisting in the army. That means you allow nations to stick to conscriptions. You allow for individuals to be forced to die because they are unwilling to do this. And this is harmful because you take away the liberty of these people to let them feel like death is something that's meaningful. Lastly, when it comes to voicing out against regime, I'll explain to this more because this also engages with opening government. To weigh all this risk as an ingredient of liberation, I think first and foremost, it's more important than your interpersonal relationship because number one, when it comes to tangible benefits, it benefits the entire human race when it comes to drug testing, for instance, or like individuals enlisting in the army, for instance. I think these are important things that happens. Secondly, it's about when it comes to the macro utilitarian benefits and of democracy. I think it happens better on our side because individuals all globally are able to express this benefit, and this is exactly why we need people to not fear death at the end of the day. Why do we take out to opening government? Because CG is less important when it comes to DK, because they also argue what OG argues. I'm just going to talk about why OG is out and purposely taking out CG as well. Firstly, OG's winning metric is when you have good connections. This is a meaningful life because you went through and gain experience for you to be able to have this meaningful life in the first place. The first argument is, who are you to decide this meaningful life? Because if individuals believe that they sacrifice their life for the causes of their brothers, for instance, because they want to end oppression, this is a meaningful life to them. Who are you to judge that this is not a meaningful life for these individuals? You can't decide that. That means on the side of opening government to undermine the sacrifices of these individuals when it comes to making changes happen for the people on the ground. Things like Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, right? This criteria is not accessible to a lot of people. It's the second thing, right? Firstly, let's talk about why suffering needs to be dealt with first, because this is an a priori when it comes to making sure people have the meaningful life that they want to at the end of the day. If you say that, like, firstly, when it comes to, like, let's analyze the suffering first, right? When it comes to getting out of poverty, because I believe opening government tricks are saying that, you know, if you have poverty, just live with it, find something else that makes you happy. Let's look about it, right? You can't figure this out because when it comes to poverty, these individuals don't choose to live in poverty. This is a result of birth lottery. Like, for instance, these individuals don't choose to be poor. That means if you say that at least you try to alleviate yourself from poverty, that means you allow the suffering to continue and then say, you know what, at least you're not, at least you're happy that you're living in poverty. You romanticize that these people are living in poverty. That's why, like, a lot of countries don't do anything and are negligent when it comes to poverty, because you continue to romanticize why is it that poverty is something that can be dealt with through happiness. Second, it's when it comes to about people who are depressive. Firstly, I think this idea of meaningful life in open government is the reason why people are depressive in the first place, because they are just unable to attain all those relationships that open government wants to argue for, and also because they are unable to attain any of the personalized happiness that comes from closing government. The reason why this is harmful is because these individuals continue their life thinking that they haven't achieved that meaningful life that was set up by government. That means they continue to suffer to at least find that solace at the end of the day. That means they're wasting a lot of their time to make sure that they are able to get at the end of the day. And when they are unable to attain all this meaningful life, they resort to depression because they're just unable to find alternatives to get that particular meaningful life. This is the reason why it's harmful, because you need individuals who are suffering from depression to disallow these individuals to voice out, because apparently that is a taboo topic. You don't want to talk about it because your therapist will probably say, you know what, life is better, go on, look for something that can make your life a lot better. Lastly, and this deals with both opening government and closing government when it comes to the social justice, the social movement things, right? People who are suffering or victims of oppression, if ending suffering of your people depends on you combating your oppressors, things like risking your life to make sure that you are able to have a movement going on, this is where we get it back on outside the house. Because in the world of government, you are unwilling to take that trade-off, or you are unwilling to risk your life. This looks like Black Lives Matter movement protesters going toe-to-toe with armed police officers just to make sure they are able to get justice across. This looks like people cowering in fear, trading off any bits of life that they can, and succumbing to the nature that is depressive in their world because they believe that if they die, it's meaningless at the end of the day. This is harmful in the very best. Go to opening.
If the logic of not fearing death is consistent on CO, what is stopping people from actively trying to go into reckless things that can result in death?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Can you repeat that?
If the logic of not fearing death is consistent on CO, what is actively stopping people from going into things that cause death, not just things that prevent death?
I feel like going into like social movements, I think there's a reason why these individuals are able to stop death. I think the reason why you would have this part to begin with is because people are actually willing to die for the causes. I think this is where we get the most benefit. We don't change the world just by saying that, you know what, let's wait until the phases comes by in life, because apparently if you wait long enough, you're probably going to get something beautiful at the end of the day. Look, it doesn't happen that way. If you're living in a shithole, you're going to live in a shithole for years if you just continue to wait. Lastly, let's talk about why we're better than opening opposition, because I think opening opposition also didn't have what it takes when it comes to arguing the tangible benefits in life. I think when it comes to opening opposition, they argue to you why is it that personalized experience is something that's very important to them. I think that that's true to a certain extent, but they also have to argue why is it that when it comes to like the ability for people to opt into decisions that that they think something that's short and give them benefit is something that they have to prove. The analysis that we provide more than opening opposition is just to say that people who choose to die for the causes can have that meaningful life. I think this is where we combat the entire narrative of meaningful life in the world of government, and also at the end of the day, prove why we're better than opening opposition. With that said, very proud to die for the cause of Mara.
All right, thank you very much to the opposition whip and all the debaters for the very fine grand final. So we're going to go deliberate right now. And so for all the observers and the debaters as well, you can just chill in this Zoom call, and then the award ceremony will be out in a bit.